Jane Priti Patel.
So, Deputy Speaker, first of all, it's a pleasure to follow the very thoughtful and considered remarks of the Chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee. And if I may just say, her forensic analysis of funding that has not actually been as transparent as it should be, and I'm going to come on to expand on this myself. I'm pleased to be able to speak on the estimates for the Home Office and actually make some wider observations about expenditure. But I should also say, Mr. Deputy Speaker, at the outset, that controlling expenditure in any government department clearly has its challenges, especially when events and circumstances, largely beyond any minister's or government's control, land upon a government, and COVID, the pandemic, being one example of that. And I was in the Home Office during the pandemic, but also unforeseen events such as Ukraine, although we did end up planning for that, but also Operation Pitin, which, you know, was one of those very significant operations that cross-government you work on, and, you know, you scramble around and work out the funding and the finances per department afterwards, because there are a lot of operational costs. And as a result, of course, spending profiles change. And I also know, and I think I can sort of say this because I was once in the Treasury a long time ago, and people know my view on the fiscal form and fiscal fitness in government, but some of this can also have inflationary pressures. And by that I'm not just referring to the macro global economic pressures such as the Ukraine war, but actually more domestically, and as the Chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee has already pointed out, inflationary pressures when it comes to hotel costs, for example. You have the government effectively having a monopoly on hotel rooms that then drives prices up, and there is no real alternative and options if the government doesn't have a plan. And I'm going to come on to the type of plan that actually would not have led to the situation, the fiscal situation that the Home Office finds itself in now. It's inevitable, you know, during the pandemic, for example, responding to public health advice relating to asylum accommodation, no longer being able to detain, but actually having the distancing measures in asylum accommodation, and what that therefore meant actually led to the use of hotel use, and also action to respond to the growth in illegal migration, which the Chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee has already highlighted. And in fact, the very helpful, useful financial numbers that have been provided by the House of Commons Library, again, shows the figures over the last 5 years, the increases, but also since the baseline of the last spending review settlement in this particular area increases going up by 110%. So there are some very significant challenges here. Now, the Home Office, as the wonderful document from the Treasury on the central government supplementary estimates demonstrates, the Home Office has a wide range of responsibilities, including vital work around counter-terrorism activities and keeping our streets safe, support for the police uplift programme, work around violence reduction units, all announced by the Chancellor last year, or last week, and touched upon. But a lot of the investment measures that's gone into tackling domestic abuse and violence against women and girls, and the lead the department has taken on modern day slavery, is just so critical. That's now business as usual, and absolutely important, it really is. But of course, and again, the notes speak to the responsibilities around issuing visas and passports, and the income and the revenue that comes in from that to sustain it. And then, of course, control of our borders, immigration and asylum matters. And at the heart of these activities, ministers and budget holders must have value for money and transparency always at the forefront of their actions. My mantra was very known in every government department that I've stepped foot in. We must follow the money, people, activities and outcomes, and be fiscally responsible. But as this debate has already shown, thanks to the introductory remarks from the Chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee, we have to have transparency. And it is right that there is accountability and transparency around how key policy decisions come together. But having seen the figures in the supplementary estimates covering the Home Office, including over £4 billion of additional funding for resource DEL for asylum support, resettlement and accommodation, there are a number of issues that are raised, which I know the front bench will look to address in their response. And if I may, this has been touched on already, but you know, when it comes to asylum accommodation, it's obvious that it's not working. I think there are serious questions to be asked of the department and ministerial direction and decisions at least over the last 14 months. And I say this because, speaking to the point about public expenditure and transparency, a lot of, for example, Rwanda, and I'm going to come on to that shortly, but a lot of the proposals that link to the National Anti-Borders Act, for example, I know the chair of the Select Committee touched on the Illegal Migration Act as it now is. Our work touched on the new plan for immigration, which was a clear public document that looked at not just asylum accommodation, but reform of the entire system, where you could break down the ultimate costs and be quite transparent about that by planning for future accommodation needs, working to establish the Greek-style reception centres and increase detained sites, which of course speaks to not even using hotels, but actually having government-funded accommodation, which would have assisted the government in processing claims quickly and promptly, which clearly is the crux of all of this, as the chair of the committee has pointed out, with processing claims going up by over 100%. There are serious questions to be asked there. Why was the digital level of processing around asylum claims that would have taken place in these centres not forthcoming? And why did that not materialise? And that's only one aspect of what should have been the new plan for immigration, and implementing these serious measures that would have led to financial transparency, but quite frankly, accountability around public spending. But also having the deterrent effect of those trying to enter the UK through dangerous and illegal routes, reducing the pull factor by having accommodation that quite frankly isn't moving around from one hotel after the other, but processing claims in these centres and having cost-effective solutions. And one example, if I may, Mr Deputy Speaker, the development of the site at Linton-on-Ouse in 2022. That site should have been up and running by October 2022. It would now be in use, supporting the efforts to tackle illegal migration by accommodating over 1,500 people with detained facilities, and obviously addressing some of those wider issues that the government at the time sought to address. Of course, there were start-up costs with that, but of course, you know, they're all now sort of blended into the estimates and the supplementary estimates and the 4 billion additional spending that is now being retrospectively sought. And again, as a result, the Home Office, because of scrapping and abandoning these plans, has fallen behind where it should have been on establishing a robust network of detention sites, proper accommodation facilities, proper processing plans, and transparency and digitalisation that would have led to fundamental reform of the asylum and accommodation system. And instead, this time last year, what do we have? Well, the chair of the Select Committee has touched on the infamous barge, Bibi Stockholm, and again, the set-up costs there. But in my district, in Braintree itself, what do we have? We have RAF Wethersfield, and all the established problems that we now have there, and the additional start-up costs, and all the supplementary costs that have gone in to deal with problems that were not even anticipated at the outset. And I have to say, some of these problems are ones that I had raised myself, around health outbreaks, for example, policing, the additional resourcing on policing, you know, the costs that the local council has to pick up, including the county council. And when these decisions were made, concerns were raised about the suitability of these locations, and I have to say, I think it's incredibly disappointing that ministers at the time were incredibly tin-eared about all of this, and not transparent around the funding, not transparent around the decision making. And it was my local authorities in particular that had to work with me to get the information out of the Home Office. And as the chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee will know, none of this information was readily available to the Select Committee, which is simply not acceptable. And I have to say, for my colleagues on the front bench in particular, I'm very conscious, if I may say so, they're having to pick up a lot of this because they were not ministers in the department at the time. And I do think it's incredibly unfair now. This is retrospective, the money that is now in these supplementary estimates, but there is an opportunity to go forward to be much more transparent and demonstrate that the department actually has learnt lessons from, quite frankly, the most appalling processes and the ministerial indifference that we saw in the Home Office over the last 12 months or so to actually improve this, because I think that's incredibly important, particularly while we're still dealing with many of these issues in Wethersfield, where it's supposed to reach full capacity now, about 1,700 people. Currently on site, we have around 1/3 of that level. but we do have a lot of issues. And again, those issues cost money, and the Home Office will bear the brunt of that through the various local authorities who are having to deal with this. Braintree District Council, Essex County Council in particular, on-site medical facilities, access to primary care, mental health, reasonable accommodation, the cost of transport, all the various associated costs. And now, of course, we have the issue around Class Q, but now Special Development Order has been issued, and what that actually means for the long-term costs of the department and running this site. Again, there is nothing that has been published, and my residents in Braintree District are left in the dark over this, along with, quite frankly, Parliament is as well, on the wider cost implications. Now, the associated costs with illegal migration are clearly staggering, and that's already been exposed. However, I think, if I may, this may speak to the recent publication of the reports by the former Borders Inspectorate, David Neal. There were other reports that were literally not just commissioned by the department, but we sought to publish them, which would have led to a much more robust approach around border force and the way in which border force agreements with France, but how the Home Office conducted its business, could have led to some serious reform, some good prudent fiscal management, but importantly some proper investment into technology at the border. And I suspect some of this was touched on by David Neal. And that, of course, was the review into border force conducted by Alexander Downer, who gave an excellent report. I don't know if the Home Affairs Select Committee even saw that report, but it seemed to be buried. And I know for a fact that there were some very serious and some good recommendations in there that would have absolutely led to some fundamental reform at the border, and I suspect David Neal would have also agreed with some of those measures too. The department has been silent on this, and I don't think there's been any progress. I don't think there's been any implementation on any of the recommendations. But of course, even the basic things such as better engagement with industry, developing better technologies, taking a more long-term strategic approach to border security is absolutely what was planned at the Home Office. I feel it's somewhat unfair to ask or demand the front bench to explain what has happened, but I think the House should know, because at the end of the day, these reports were commissioned to invest in the border, a digital border, long-term measures that would actually make our border much more secure, much more efficient, tackle issues such as illegal migration, but also the issue about documentation being disposed of when people were coming into our country, and all the wider challenges that, you know, my honourable friend the Minister is familiar with as well. And of course, that touched upon the work with France and the funding that we gave to France, which certainly since my departure now, I think has increased to over £500 million. I think, again, the public should know and hear much more as to what value for money that has brought, but importantly, what the outcomes are, because those are unprecedented sums. But again, how is increasing use of surveillance at the border being leveraged to actually go after the criminal gangs, more activity on patrol and law enforcement around the French coast? A very difficult French coastline, I should add as well, because of how large it is and how difficult it is to police. And I do want to pay tribute to everybody that works in this particular area. But, you know, so far, again, we've seen a number of Channel crossing arrivals pass over 3,500 alone, which obviously is higher than the same point last year. And it is important, I think, when £500 million is being spent, that, again, the public and the House sees a level of transparency around what is going on. I would, Mr Deputy Speaker, just like to touch on the Rwanda partnership. I think it's important, I really do. There'll be a debate in the House again on Monday around the bill, the Safety of Rwanda bill, when it comes back. But I think it is really important, and I say this because I negotiated the original partnership, and I came to the House and at the outset spelt out the original costings of £120 million. And that partnership was an economic and migration development partnership. It's quite clear that the principle of the Rwanda partnership, currently as it stands, has moved miles away from the original economic and migration development partnership. And I'd have to say, I think that's deeply concerning. There has been zero transparency. As the chair of the Select Committee has pointed out, what on earth has gone on over the last 12 months around this partnership, other than funneling more public cash into this and to the government of Rwanda? And I would just like to say, on the government of Rwanda and the partnership originally, it was, in my view, a world-leading partnership, and other countries in Europe, I know to this day from conversations that I am having, are still looking to look at that model and may follow it because of various European countries also taking an interest because of wider migration issues across Europe and destabilisation in the world. But I do just want to say that there's been far too much criticism of the country and the government of Rwanda, and some of them are ill-informed, misleading and inaccurate. And I think actually for a country that has experienced significant economic growth, rising living standards this century, with 1 million more people lifted out of poverty in their own country and life expectancy increasing, it's important that we do not malign Rwanda. They joined the Commonwealth in 2009. They have worked with UNHCR to support over 130,000 refugees, and it is a country. It is a country that is committed to playing a leadership role on the African continent to make a contribution to tackling one of the biggest challenges that they face and we face, and I say they face on the African continent, which is that of mass migration. I want to pay tribute to the Foreign and International Cooperation Minister in Rwanda, Vincent Biruta, and the High Commissioner in London, because they have been outstanding in their engagement with the government and myself and others. And it's important that I think we make this partnership work. I am sceptical, I have to say, about what we've read about in the press. I think that's the best way to put it this week as to how that will work. Which does bring me on to the issue, which has been touched on already, that again, we have to be practical. The Home Office is an operational department. Operational, day-to-day operational costs inevitably are very high. But at the same time, when it comes to voluntary removals and reception centres, which we don't have right now, but actually even providing detained facilities and the cost of running detained facilities and the supporting staff that are required, it is right that we negotiate these contracts properly, transparently, and that I think everyone has the right kind of scrutiny that's required. And I say this because if something goes wrong, not just with those contracts, but when incidents happen, and they have happened in the past, where it leads to the Home Office then having legal action taken against them over a handling, for example, of a voluntary return or a migrant that is being removed, the challenges are just absolutely enormous. And the reputational... of course I will.
Does my right honourable friend recall that when the announcement was made about, I think it was the £500 million that was being made available to the French for some form of centre for processing these, right, yes. The very next day, the European Union announced that they weren't going to be allowed to do it. Doesn't that give us a very big message about potential waste of money on quite a big scale?
He makes a very important point, and actually he's given me the chance to just expand upon all this from an operational perspective. That was over a year ago when that was considered to be a flagship announcement from the government, and we have not seen that detention centre in France open up at all yet. I actually think it was due to open in 2025, but notwithstanding that, the government should report back. The government should report back what has happened to the money, what processes are in place, even updates in terms of that partnership that has been established. But my honourable friend mentions the EU, so that would have been the Commission in particular, who I have spent a lot of time with, and I think it was important to have those discussions as well. Do not forget that the Commission and the EU funded the Greek-style reception centres in Greece, which actually has gone a long way to deter illegal migration to Greece and actually to stop those awful crossings that were taking place. And I actually pay tribute to the former Minister for Interior in Greece, Notis Mikaratris, who did an outstanding job on this, and I worked with him to look at the replication of the Greek-style reception centres in the UK, because as we showed in the new plan for immigration, you could follow the money, you could develop operational plans that were transparent, and you could actually see the deterrent impact on that coming forward as well. And that is absolutely critical, it really is. My final point is very much to legislation that has passed this House in this entire space of asylum, illegal migration, over the last 2 years. We've had 2 bills. One was last year, the Illegal Migration Act. The other one prior to that was when I was Home Secretary, which was the National Anti-Borders Act. I do want to put on record, and ministers will know my view, and everyone in government knows my view on this, I think it's really not good enough that having passed the legislation is not enacted. And the National Anti-Borders Act is the Act of Parliament that I will speak to on this particular point. Because again, if you want to follow the money and drive outcomes, enacting the legislation is absolutely crucial. And we had left in the department a fully costed operational plan on the inaction of the NABA, as it now is, which would have introduced the one-stop shop. So speaking to the point about reducing processing costs, for example, reducing the time it takes to process cases, the one-stop shop, the immigration courts and tribunals would have gone a long way to addressing that. And here we are, over 12 months, 14 months later since that has been enacted. That has not happened. Ditto on the reception centres and the accommodation centres. At the time, the costs were envisaged to be £120 million. That includes the start-up cost. The processing cost would obviously then come into that through digitalisation of asylum cases. I have to say, I think it's inexcusable that the needle has not been moved on that. And it is not acceptable anymore for people, once a revolving door comes in, to just sort of discard these plans and say, actually, we don't need those and we can have newer plans. Because all this does is kicks the can down the road and increases the level of government expenditure that takes place. And quite frankly, this unprecedented situation where retrospectively the Home Secretary of the day is trying to retrospectively get the approval of over £4 billion of public spending for asylum accommodation. So I think, Madam Deputy Speaker, whether it's the partnership with Rwanda, cross-border work with the French authorities, implementation of provisions in our legislation, delivery of accommodation centres, I can say that there were plans in place, absolutely, but, we must get back on track. And I think the purpose of today's debates as well should send out 2 messages. Yes, to the Home Office, but also for future spending reviews as well. I mean, we've had this period where, it's been annual SR periods. We have to go back to 5-year SR periods. We have to have the proper fiscal transparency led by the Treasury. Ministers have to be held to account in terms of public expenditure. And we have to go back to the core principle of following money, people, outcomes. Thank you.